The memo was short, almost bland. 3 pages typed on U.S. Air Force letterhead, sent from a NATO base in Suffolk to the British Ministry of Defense. The subject line read, Unexplained Lights. According to the memo, security patrols had seen strange lights moving through Rendlesham Forest over 2 nights in late December 1980. Radiation readings had been taken. Photographs had been attempted. The lights, the author wrote, appeared to beam down onto the ground. The MOD's response was equally brief. Nothing here suggested a threat to national defense. The file was closed. And yet that memo had been written by the deputy base commander of a facility believed to house U.S. nuclear weapons. It referenced real-time audio recordings, dozens of trained military witnesses, and a location that 40 years later still draws people down a signposted UFO trail through the pines. Tonight we reopen that file. A cold Christmas in Suffolk. Rendlesham Forest lies between 2 former RAF bases on the Suffolk coast, Bentwaters and Woodbridge. In 1980, both were leased to the United States Air Force. They were part of NATO's front line in the Cold War, and multiple sources now accept that nuclear weapons were stored on site. In the early hours of the 26th of December 1980, the forest was quiet. Temperatures hovered near freezing. Most of the base was recovering from Christmas celebrations. Just after 3 a.m., a 3-man security patrol near the east gate of RAF Woodbridge saw a bright object descending beyond the tree line. At first they thought an aircraft had gone down. The men, Staff Sergeant Jim Peniston, Airman John Burroughs, and Airman Ed Kabansag, obtained permission to leave the perimeter and moved into the forest to investigate. What happened next depends on which record you believe. In their original written statements, the men described a pulsing light in the trees, an apparent beacon that seemed to retreat as they chased it. Eventually they realized it lay beyond the forest, near a farmhouse, and in line with a coastal lighthouse. Kabansag wrote that they were chasing a beacon light off in the distance. Burroughs explicitly identified a lighthouse. Later retellings by Peniston and Burroughs would grow more dramatic. A metallic, triangular craft on the forest floor, strange symbols etched into its skin, even a physical encounter. But those details do not appear in the contemporaneous paperwork. What does appear the next morning is a small catalog of physical traces. Investigators noted 3 shallow depressions in the ground arranged in a triangle, as if something heavy had rested there. Nearby tree trunks showed scuffed or scorched patches of bark. Plaster casts were taken of the holes. And a 10 jet overflew the area at dawn to check for any surviving wreckage or intruder, but nothing unusual was seen from the air. Local police, called out twice, judged the depressions to be animal diggings, probably rabbits, and the scorches to be axe marks from foresters. So far, the record offers a familiar pattern: strange lights, ambiguous traces, and 2 competing readings: extraordinary encounter or misidentified normality. The case might have ended there. It didn't. The halt night. 2 evenings later, on the 28th of December, the UFO business interrupted an officer's party. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, the deputy base commander, was at Woodbridge when the night security commander, Bruce England, entered with news. The lights were back in the forest. This time, Halt decided to handle it himself. He assembled a small team, including Sergeant Bobby Ball and Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, along with the Disaster Preparedness NCO, Sergeant Monroe Nevels, carrying a Geiger counter. Floodlights and portable light-alls were driven out toward the tree line. Halt slipped a microcassette recorder into his coat pocket and began narrating events in real time. Almost as soon as the team reached the edge of the woods, the equipment started playing up. Light-alls failed without obvious cause. Radio communications were plagued by bursts of static. Later, Halt and others would argue that this mirrored the interference reported by the first night witnesses. Skeptics counter that portable generators are not renowned for reliability on cold, uneven ground at 3 a.m. Halt's tape picks up his voice as the group moves along a forest track. We're about 150 feet from the initial site. Having a little difficulty getting the light-alls to work. We're going to take some readings with the Geiger counter. At the clearing where the depressions had been found, Neville's meter clicks faster. Halt comments on peaks of 7 milliro engines per hour in the centers of the holes and on the sides of nearby trees. A short distance away, readings fall back to around 03 or 4, close to normal background. To a lay listener, that sounds like a meaningful spike. Later analysis by radiation experts, including plant biologist Dr. Michelle Clare and independent skeptics, concluded that the figures were well within natural variation and that the instrument was being pushed to the edge of its sensitivity. In essence, the high readings were still background noise. Radiation aside, the men are there to look for lights, and before long, Halt's recorder captures them reacting to exactly that. Across an adjacent field, beyond a line of trees, a reddish light appears. On the tape, Halt describes it as like an eye, winking, occasionally shedding small particles of light. At one point he notes tensely, "It's coming this way. It's definitely moving this way. This is weird." For over an hour, the team tracks this light, and others, sometimes losing them behind trees, sometimes watching them appear to break into pieces and reform. Halt also records 3 star-like objects hovering low on the horizon, 2 to the north, 1 to the south, that seem to beam down shafts of light. One of these, he says, sends a beam directly into the weapons storage area at Betwater's, several miles away. No independent record of those beams exists, but the tape preserves the men's reactions, surprise, tension, and repeated efforts to measure and map what they're seeing. On the ground, local residents were not entirely oblivious. A woman named Sarah Richardson, whose bedroom overlooked part of the base, later told researchers she had seen strange, banded lights in the direction of the forest that same night. Her testimony is one of several civilian accounts that broadly match the timing of the military reports, though they lack the detail of Halt's running commentary. By dawn, the second investigation is over. Halt returns to base, writes up his memo titled Unexplained Lights, and forwards it up the chain. The U.S. Air Force does not open a formal inquiry. When the man eventually reviews the memo, it declares the case of no defense significance and files it away, but the story refuses to stay filed. The aftershocks. In the early 1980s, British ufologist Jenny Randles begins hearing rumors of a UFO landing at a U.S. base in Suffolk. She tracks the story through journalists, radar operators, and eventually serving personnel, compiling an early chronology in her booklet Sky Crash and later in a fuller account, UFO Crash Landing. Friend or foe? When Halt's tape and memo leaked to researchers in the mid-1980s, they transformed what had been local gossip into a documented case. Unlike most UFO reports, Rendlesham now has contemporaneous audio, official paperwork, and a cluster of trained witnesses. Newspaper stories start calling it Britain's Roswell. Over time, more layers accumulate. Some U.S. personnel claim that radar at other bases picked up an unknown target over the coast that night, though written confirmation is scarce and often second-hand. Peniston and Burroughs go public with expanded versions of their experiences, including close-up observation of a triangular craft and, in Peniston's later account, physical contact and a download of binary code. Those additions appeared decades after the fact and are disputed even within the UFO community. Other writers, including former MOD UFO desk officer Nick Pope and more recent researcher Gary Hesseltine, focus on the link between the sightings and the presence of nuclear weapons at Bentwaters, arguing that whatever was in the forest showed an interest in the base's most sensitive assets. Jenny Randles herself eventually steps back from the extraterrestrial reading she initially helped popularize. She comes to see Rendlesham as a tangle of misperceptions, rumors, and partial truths, still puzzling, but not necessarily otherworldly. And then there's the Orford Ness connection. The shadow of Cobra Mist. Look east from the forest edge, and you face the North Sea. Beyond the fields and marshes lies Orford Ness, a shingle spit that has hosted secret British and Anglo-American experiments for much of the 20th century. In the early 1970s, it held Cobra Mist, an over-the-horizon radar designed to peer deep into Soviet airspace. The project was abandoned after engineers were unable to eliminate a persistent, unexplained noise source in the system, an electronic snowstorm that made the radar near useless. By 1980, the Cobra Mist antenna field had been repurposed as a powerful transmitting station. To some researchers, including Randles, that raises a tantalizing question. Could experimental transmissions from Orford Ness have interfered with equipment at Bentwaters and Woodbridge, or even produced visible ionization effects in the moist winter air above the forest? There is, so far, no hard evidence that any secret test was underway on the nights in question. Official histories place Cobra Mist's radar operations years earlier, and the later broadcast site was aimed at Europe, not at nearby forests. Still, the geography is suggestive. A Cold War radar range and transmitter, a nuclear-armed airbase, unexplained lights between them. This is how mysteries grow, not from a single piece of evidence, but from the way separate threads refuse to sit neatly in one narrative. Explanations that almost fit. So what, if anything, happened in Rendlesham Forest? 3 broad readings compete. 1. The skeptical synthesis. The most straightforward account stitches together known phenomena. Astronomers have identified a bright fireball, likely a meteor, over southern England at roughly the same time the first patrol reported an object descending into the forest. To men on the ground already primed by the thought of a crash that could have looked like something falling behind the trees, the pulsing light that Burroughs and Cabansag chased on the first night lies in exactly the same direction as Orford Ness lighthouse, whose sweeping beam was one of the brightest in the country at the time. The men's statements describe closing on a light only to find a farmhouse and beacon beyond, the profile of a lighthouse seen through woodland. The landing marks at the site were judged by both Suffolk police and forestry workers to be rabbit diggings, the bark marks routine axe cuts. Radiation measurements, once examined in context, look like normal background. The star-like objects that Halt saw to the north and south match the position of bright stars, including Sirius, and their apparent movement can be explained by atmospheric distortion and the stress of prolonged observation in the dark. On this reading, Rendlesham is less a single event than a cluster of misinterpretations, compounded by expectation and retelling. Think of it as a recipe. Take a bright meteor, add a lighthouse, throw in background radiation and animal diggings, and season heavily with Cold War nerves. This explanation covers a lot. It matches the earliest, most contemporaneous evidence. It accounts for why civilian authorities lost interest quickly. It also aligns with Jenny Randles' later view that no unearthly craft were seen in Rendlesham Forest, only everyday phenomena under unusual circumstances. But it doesn't quite close the file. It leaves hanging the sincerity of the witnesses, especially those who maintained for decades that what they saw was structured and mechanical. It leaves unaddressed the claims, however weakly sourced, of radar tracks, beams into the weapons storage area, and continuing anomalies around the bases. And it doesn't fully explain why trained observers, including an experienced officer like Halt, were so shaken. 2. The unknown craft hypothesis. The second reading accepts the witnesses at close to face value. Here, the lights are not misidentified stars and lighthouses, but manifestations of a craft or technology we do not yet understand, whether extraterrestrial, non-human, or some undisclosed black project. The credibility of this view rests on the convergence of factors rarely present in UFO cases: multiple military witnesses, a running audio record, documented attempts at measurement, and an official memo acknowledging the events. Supporters point to the way the main light on the second night appears to move intelligently through the trees, the reported pencil-thin beams striking the ground, and the long-standing pattern of UFO reports clustered around nuclear facilities. They note that some alleged radar data, if ever fully confirmed, would move the case from lights in the sky to a tracked object entering and leaving controlled airspace. But this interpretation has its own problems. Key elements rely on late, uncorroborated testimony. The supposed binary code download, for example, appears decades after the event and sits uneasily beside the original much plainer statements. Some physical evidence is weak or ambiguous, and no clear, independent instrument record, not radar plots, not photographs, has emerged that cannot be otherwise explained or questioned. The unknown craft hypothesis makes sense of the emotional weight of the witnesses' stories. It doesn't yet meet the standard of proof that would move the incident out of the gray zone. 3. The manufactured mystery. A third, more speculative line suggests human hands behind at least part of the story. In this reading, classified operations, perhaps linked to electronic warfare testing from Orford Ness, or to security drills around nuclear weapons, caused unusual lights, equipment malfunctions, or both. Confusion among lower-ranking personnel was either an unintended side effect or a deliberately tolerated one, useful for masking the true purpose of the activity. Advocates of this view argue that the proximity of Cobra Mist's successor transmitters, the history of cover stories at Orford Ness, and the MOD's apparent disinterest in a high-profile incursion near a nuclear site all hint that something sensitive was at stake. The difficulty here is evidence. Beyond geography and plausibility, there is little hard data tying any specific experiment to the nights in question. Official documents place Cobra Mist's active radar years earlier. The broadcast station's known uses involve external transmission, not forced illuminating tests. Until records surface that bridge that gap, this remains an intriguing, but unproven, overlay. 2 readings, 1 forest. More than 4 decades after those cold December nights, Rendlesham Forest is quiet again. The bases have closed. The lighthouse has been decommissioned. Visitors now follow waymarked paths to a sculpture that suggests the outline of a craft installed at the end of the official UFO trail. The paper trail, by contrast, is anything but quiet. We have Halt's tape and memo, witness statements, skeptical analyses, MOD files, decades of books, and hours of testimony. The record is dense. It is not conclusive. We're left with 2 broad possibilities. The first is that Rendlesham was, at its core, a textbook case of human perception under stress. Lights in the sky, shadows between trees, and ordinary readings misread as extraordinary. On this view, what makes the case famous is not the phenomenon itself, but the unusual quality of the documentation that followed. The second is that something genuinely anomalous intruded on a nuclear-armed base over several nights, and that, despite the paperwork, we still do not quite grasp what it was, craft, experiment, or some atmospheric effect we haven't yet mapped. Neither option is entirely comfortable. One makes us confront how easily our senses, even trained ones, can be led astray. The other implies that an event of real significance brushed past the edges of official awareness and slipped into the trees. The file, officially, may be closed. The questions between the pines are not, because every mystery hides a truth.